Welcome to Playing with Fire, the podcast for people who are ready to custom build their love.
We're talking about non-monogamy, however you design it, as an individuation opportunity.
Want to leave the default and make your life spectacularly you? You're in the right place.
Hi, Jolie.
Hey.
So we have a great episode today.
My eyes just bugged out of my head. I'm really excited about this episode.
It's very exciting. We are talking with Eve Rickert and Andrea Zanin about the new edition of More Than Two. It's fantastic.
And a little dip into Andrea's other book, post non-monogamy. I'm like, and beyond. Lots of good stuff. You know what? The interview is great. I don't think we need to talk about this. Let's just get people into it.
Let them know who they are.
Excellent. So Eve Rickert is a Gen X queer solo polyamorous relationship anarchist neurodivergent cis woman living on unceded Wasanic and Lahuasian territory. I think I got it. On the west coast of the place currently known as Canada. She is curator of the More Than Two Essentials series and the non-monogamy resource site morethan2.ca. Remember the CA, morethan2.ca. In fact, that's exactly where you'll go to find these amazing books. I recommend that you remember to do that after listening to this awesome episode. Eve is the founder and publisher of Thornapple Press and the founder and mastermind of the science communications firm Talk Science to Me. And their co-author, Andrea Zanin, is a queer writer who focuses on non-monogamy and BDSM leather. Andrea has written for the Globe and Mail, the Tyee, Bitch, Ms. Extra, In Magazine, Outlooks Magazine, and the Montreal Mirror. Their scholarly work, fiction, and essays appear in a variety of collections. Andrea blogs at sexgeek.wordpress.com, where they created the 10 rules for happy non-monogamy and coined the term polynormativity. Maybe we'll have Andrea back to talk about that more in depth. But for now, enjoy this episode. And absolutely, this is one that I can heartily recommend. Add it to your collection, even if you've been around the block a while, or if you're brand new to non-monogamy. This one's going right on my bookshelf. I loved reading it. Eve, Andrea, thank you so very much for joining us. I'm so excited.
Happy to be here.
It is truly a pleasure to talk to authors of a book that I'm genuinely excited to add it to my own bookcase, and my bookcases are filled to the brim with pretty much every book published on the topic of non-monogamy, both academic and non-academic. And I gotta say, I read the copy and I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna feel. And I am just a hands down proponent. I am so excited and so thrilled for what you've put out into the world. I am like beside myself. I did not know how good it would be. I was like looking forward. But is this too much praise? Like, I hope at least one of you has a praise kink, because I'm just so thrilled. Like,
yeah, and I have more praise. So yeah,
this is a great way to start an interview.
Right?
Yeah. I was going to say, I think I see the spine of the first edition right there behind your head with the blues, and I'm really curious where you're going to sort our cover on your bookshelf,
right?
Because
I know it would go there behind my head, but it can't go there. So the whole bookcase is going to have to get redesigned. Just the whole thing. That's the only way. I have to make important. Sometimes you have to do hard things, and the whole bookcase is just going to have to get flip flopped.
You don't want to eclipse the book.
No, I can't. I'm going to have to make special space for it. It's true. I'm just dying for more people to come out with orange covers. There aren't enough orange covers in the world. So, but I do have all the colors. So thank you for writing. Thank you for the energy. I am so excited to ask you first, why did you feel like this was a need? I mean, the first edition was there. It's served many people. Why go to all of this effort?
I'm going to let you take that one, Eve.
Yeah. Well, I'll start, and Andrea, if you want to add anything on, then feel free. But, where to start with that? I started to see, you'll edit out all of this.
Yeah.
Pausing and stuff and thinking. When the first edition came out, when I wrote the first edition, I really felt like, well, I guess when I wrote it, I didn't know what to think about it. It was just, sort of came out and said what I needed to say. And then after the reception of the first edition and so many people saying like this, it was so amazing and it was life-changing, I started to feel like, wow, like I've really contributed something of importance to the world. But then, over time, I'm always extremely critical of my own work under the best of circumstances. And over time, I started to see, I think two things happened. One was I started to see the flaws in the book that had always been there. I started to see things happening in communities and in people's lives that were sort of like ideas from the book taken to extremes that I had not anticipated. The world changed. I changed. My ideas changed, and I think you can see this in the new edition. We try to show our work a little bit about that, and so originally, and plus, I bought the rights in 2023, and so I wanted to put a version of the book out into the world that was mine and take advantage of that opportunity to originally I just saw it as sort of fixing mistakes. I thought it was going to be more of a cosmetic job than it ended up being. And it wasn't until Andrea and I both really started diving into the work that we realized like, no, I've changed. We've changed. The world has changed. Everything has changed a lot more than I realized. And I hadn't read the book since I'd written it. And so just the process of rereading it and realizing like there are just huge, like so much of my perspective has changed on so many things. And there are so many new voices, not just in non-monogamy, but in relationships, in ethics, in just how we are in the world. And I've been really absorbing that for years now. And so that has made a big impact on how I think. And so that's why, the sort of, I think the original conception was, take what was good in the original, update it, sort of excise the less good bits and put out a new version. And this ended up being something really different.
I appreciate that you saw an opportunity to create the book that I wish I had had 15 years ago when I was making the transition. And I don't say that lightly. There are a lot of great books and many authors who I deeply value the work of, but there are a couple of chapters early on, as well as your positionality, like the way that each of you like makes transparent as best as I think you can. I think you really made an honest effort at being transparent about what you're coming in with, what you are bringing to this. And that to me, I find it to be such a relief. And so as I was reading through those early chapters where you're covering topics that most of the authors tend to shy away from in the non-monogamy sphere, but like you said, ethics, abuse, power imbalances, like you're dealing with the big stuff. And I wanted to voice my appreciation for it being upfront rather than tucked away as something that we might read through the how do I get a date part and how do I not be jealous part, and then just like conveniently maybe I didn't have energy to read about ethics, which so thank you for prioritize. Like I think there's a natural prioritization that shows through and it makes sense to me. And before we go further, I wanted to say that Andrea, you also have another book that's coming out like near the same time, and I don't want to overlook that because when I was reading that, I have all of the little series. Like I've been getting them all as they come out. Love it, very excited, loving that. And Death and Non-Monogamy, by the way, lovely, loving it. But Andrea, you wrote a book that it was a title that I didn't even know to think about that. So would you tell us just a bit about that too? Because I want to consider both of these books. I think they're a great set for anyone to pick up.
Yeah, it is a little bit of a here's how and here's how not to, right? Like there's a there's an odd little bookend going on there. So my book is called Post Non-Monogamy and Beyond. It's sort of about the question. I mean, if I had to sort of give the elevator pitch, the idea is, that there's an increasing number of people in the world who are non-monogamous or who are doing non-monogamy in one way or another. And just by its very nature, that means that there's also an increasing number of people who are stopping at one point or another for any number of reasons. And so I wanted to sort of, having experienced that myself, I wanted to sort of, examine the question of what is it like, how does that happen? Why might we choose to stop, on the premise that it's not because we think non-monogamy is wrong, right? It's just that things change in our lives. Sometimes we make different choices. And then from there, okay, what does that look like? And who are we in it? And I know sort of at least some answers to that question for myself, but I am aware that in fact, there's probably more post non-monogamous people in the world than there are active non-monogamous people in the world. And so I'm not alone in this, but that means there's probably lots of different stories and lots of trajectories and lots of, so to me, it was something I wanted to open a conversation about. And I think part of it was because, I've worked with you for quite some time now and worked with the press and dealt with, you just mentioned Non-Monogamy and Death. I worked with the author on that book. I'm as an editor, right? And so, and I was asked by a few different people if I would write a book. And I kept on going, well, what would I have to say, though? I haven't done this in a long time at this point. And then finally I was like, well, maybe that is what I have to say. Like, maybe it's the fact of having done it and then stopped and then, but not feeling like that doesn't just make me go back to being a regular old person who's never done it before. Like there's some qualitative difference in who we are in the aftermath. And then who knows, maybe we'll go back in at some point too. Right. So yeah. So that was where that came from.
I love the embracing of the fluidity of relational reality, but also like claiming it, owning that you are changed by the experience of exploring non-monogamy, and because it helps me remember that it's not about going back to monogamy, because that again centers monogamy as like the way to be, but so just the phrasing of post non-monogamous made space for me to be like, oh, that could be me someday. I absolutely could imagine using that label to help someone understand me. And so I'm deeply grateful. That doesn't happen a lot these days. So thanks.
And it's funny because to me, it was just sort of like a word that made sense, but you're not actually, now that we're starting to sort of talk about this book a bit, and I did another podcast the other day, I don't think I thought of it. It's going to sound ridiculous because it's so obvious in hindsight. I don't think I thought of it as being a new identity label. But I'm realizing that people might be taking it up that way. And it's like, yeah, sure. Like, to me, it's just a naming of a phase or a state. You know what I mean? But yeah. You want to make it yours, go for it.
Yeah. I think what struck me about it is that it would not require me to set down this identity. Because non-monogamy for me has often felt like an identity, even when I'm single. Like, it just has. And so there's something really, it just felt very generous. Like, I could generously hold more of my future being. And it also created a like space to explore like a reality. I just love when something wholly new, like, oh, right, that's been there the whole time, didn't have language for it. Now I do. I can see a whole avenue of exploration, research that could be done. Just outstanding. Love that.
Can't wait to read the dissertation.
I really like how the by addressing the departure from non-monogamy without judgment, it has a parallel role model where, so you could leave monogamy without judgment, you can leave non-monogamy without judgment. I liked the parallelism of it.
Yeah.
Well, and that non-judgmental thing I know is really important to us with More Than Two. So I'm glad to hear that you feel the through line of that.
Yep.
Yeah. So let's shifting back a little bit to More Than Two. I love that these books are coming out like almost at the same time. They're just like about a month apart, less than that, maybe 3 weeks. But I'm thinking about the way that the world has changed. So the way it's changed since first edition, and even since each of you started down the path of like understanding what non-monogamy was. So what do you think what are the differences? Like, what is in More Than Two that needed to be said? Because I mean, I see it. I feel like I could make a little laundry list pretty easy, but What did you intentionally include that needed to be brought to the community at large?
I think that's one we both need to speak on. But I think it's interesting to look at sort of the evolution of this book and how it has paralleled the evolution of like the sort of visible North American non-monogamous movement in the 21st century, right? Because when we came into, in the 2000s, there was very much a focus on like hierarchy, polynormativity, the sort of couple plus model of non-monogamy. And a lot of what was in the first edition was kind of a reaction to that and an attempt to give voice to, the people who were like the secondary partners in those scenarios, the people who, and sort of put forward this idea that, we all have rights, we all have needs, but also it was very much a highly autonomous version of, so I see it as actually being sort of coming from me personally, a relationship anarchy perspective, but not a very, for me at the time, not a very well developed relationship anarchy perspective. And there was sort of the growth, an outgrowth of that became what some folks have called relationship libertarianism, which is this like hyper individualized approach to relationships that's very much in line with, I think, sort of the atomization that we're seeing in the world around us now with late stage capitalism and ecological collapse. And so, there's also been this reaction to all of that, which has been this movement towards interrelation, interdependence, community care, mutual aid, and those thought, those through lines in the broader culture have also made their way into the way people are thinking about non-monogamous relationships, and there have been great contributions to that line of thinking, and also, people turning, trying to get our attention to look more towards, what were the early forms of non-monogamy? How are they practiced in culture? How is it practiced in cultures that are not, white supremacist, colonial, capitalist cultures? So that's why we had Kim Tallbear write a foreword for the book, for example, because she's been a very vocal part of that. So I think, for example, a major shift that we made in the first edition, the key themes of the book were consent, agency, and honesty. And in the second edition, it became consent, agency, honesty, and responsibility. And then we had to look at all of the content in all the rest of the book to make sure that was carried through the whole book, as an example. And then, of course, there was the addition of, I would say there's a lot more sort of almost dialoguing of like, any one of these things, this could be multiple things, right? Like it could be this, but also it could be this, but then also it could be this, but also this. So like sort of the conversation about boundaries and the importance and validity of boundaries and respecting boundaries, but also the fact that, boundaries, I'm putting that in air quotes here, can be used as a form of emotional blackmail, as a form of emotional punishment. And there can be boundaries set in a relationship that can result in the end of the relationship. So, all boundaries may be valid in some sense, but also they may have relational consequences. So those are a couple examples of many I can think of.
They're super important, and I love the addition of responsibility is at core. Like that's it. That's what made it sing for me. That plucked the string of that's what was missing in my first non-monogamous relationship, which was extremely abusive. And Ken is sitting here. Ken has been very, very open and able to be with me in the fact that he was the abusive partner and has done 15 years of recovery to be an excellent partner, and so much healing work. But that it was the taking responsibility piece that we could not find any resources, that like we didn't even know what we were doing or the damage that was happening. But at core, it all boiled down to a lack of responsibility. Would you agree with that, Ken?
Completely.
I don't want to have invoked you without.
No, completely. The lack of responsibility and its partner accountability, for sure.
Yeah. So the theme, I guess, just as an offering, it's borne out like as my own, as the N of one that my life is for me. adding responsibility to the mix changes the whole thing. It completely, and not just like, I think everybody thinks they're being responsible.
Mm-hmm.
So calling it out and giving clear examples. I loved the examples, the way that you talked about the languaging around how we talk about abuse and what abuse is, and where we can be experiencing coercion, and that could be classified as abuse, but also we need to be careful with our language so that we can actually talk about what's going on in our relationships. And all of it. So helpful.
I was a big fan of your unpacking of boundaries. Like they are presented so often as they're a tool. They're a positive tool. They're a tool for relational individuation and growth, and also boundaries can be used irresponsibly. So I saw the theme of responsibility run through that, and I was really happy to see that, how you bring up in so much of the book. You turn it over. What does it look like from the back? Really valuable.
And I think that particular thing you're talking about, the turning it over and looking at it, I think that was a real result of this collaborative work. Because often one of us would present a thing and the other person would go, yeah, but what about, and then we go, oh, right. Okay. Well, let's include that too. And then the next person would be like, yeah, but, and also, like, so there was that's a real reflection of the back and forth that Eve and I did, which to me was actually one of the best parts of this experience. Like, it was just sort of so deeply, like, anything that either one of us put out there as a first draft, the other one got in. And it was like, I don't think there's a single piece of the book that's not really a blend of our two perspectives and voices,
As an author, I deeply appreciate that. That's that's hard. And that is not what I see most people doing. Often it's like, well, you write this chapter, I write this chapter. And yeah, there's editing, there's talk, but that is an accomplishment. And it speaks to the relationship that the two of you have built to be able to do that. And the trust, I imagine, that you've had to develop, and that it also created by actually getting in and rolling up your sleeves for it.
I say almost more so that, because we've worked together, but in a kind of independent way for a long time. But this was very much okay, let's give it a shot, with both of us. And
and I think it shows, because the multidimensional aspect of basically every page had something that I was like, okay, so that's taking something that we all talk a little bit about and then expanding it out into multiple dimensions. Yeah. So that worked.
Well, that's why the book's so big.
Right. Like, we like big books. We like big books. Andrea,
I will say,
go ahead.
Oh, I really want to hear Andrea's answer to the same question.
That's where I was going to come back.
But before we do that, I just want to say that during the last several months of writing, Andrea and I had weekly calls, and I was kind of sad when we finally, I was really happy when we finally finished the manuscript, but I was also like a little bit sad to see that sort of era come to a close, because it really was wonderful to be able to have those conversations and get really deep with stuff. So,
Well, I'm afraid you're going to have more of me than you could possibly handle when we go on a book tour together. So
we'll be fine.
By the end of that, you'll be like, I don't want to talk to you for 6 months.
You can take a vacation after.
Right. Well, we actually have a huge joint project to work on right after that, coming in October. So,
oh my goodness. Okay, so book tour in the fall of 2024, and then a huge project. Is it a secret project?
No, it's from our other life, our editing life. It's a joint editing project for the government of Canada. So
okay, do the important work. Awesome, I love this. Thank you, humans. Andrea, would you circle back to that question of what is it that needed to be said? What needed to be brought forward? Especially what needed to be different?
Well, I come at this obviously because, and from a different angle than Eve, because I didn't co-author the first one, right? So I read it at the time. I had lots of praise for it. I had certain critiques, and then I put it away and didn't think about it for 10 years, right? And so for me, it was also a revisiting of something I hadn't read in 10 years, and that I didn't have a hand in at the time, but from this different angle. And my relationship to the material shifted because I had originally come in as an editor to help with those changes that Eve sort of had listed. And then as we started discussing it, I was like, I don't know, but this one's not on your list, but I think you're probably going to want this to change too. And then over time, I started to realize that it was no longer easy to make the kinds of changes we were agreeing to make without it being clear that it was also my voice, right? And that's like an interesting shift to make. Anyway, not the question you're asking, but that's sort of, so the sort of odd angle into the material as then a writer, I would say that the things that, well, we queered it up a lot. we pulled on so many incredible, wise thinkers that have done amazing work in the time since the first book came out, whose voices are so valuable and so interesting. Both of us are avid readers, but in sort of Venn diagram ways. Like, we read different things, but then we overlap a little bit. So it was really, lots of queer thought, lots of trans thought, lots more explicit links between non-monogamy and kink, because it's in practice such a common overlap, so it, like, speaking to that when it was relevant, but also including things like perspectives on asexuality, perspectives on just a broader diversity of voices, perspectives on history, and also, I would say, just the kinds of thought that have happened in the last 10 years around attachment theory, around our understanding as a society of trauma and how it works, of how legal systems don't necessarily match up with what we need to understand as the right way to live. You know what I mean? Like, there's so much that we've both, I think, absorbed of brilliant thinkers out there in the last decade that I think whose voices were really relevant, even if they weren't thinking about non-monogamy, right? Like, because it's also relevant to relationships. So that huge pile of, like, new ideas and new thoughts. And I mean, even, like, one of my favorite examples is doing the research for the sex chapter and just sort of going, oh my God, like, in 10 years, there are diseases that used to be incurable that we can now cure with a 6-week course of treatment. And there are new diseases that didn't even exist 10 years ago. Like, the landscape has shifted, right? There's preventative methods that didn't even exist, but that now you can go to your doctor and get, like, it just, like, the whole landscape in so many ways has just shifted so drastically. So we can't just go back to this narrative of wear a condom. Like, there's so much more to think about, right? So there's just like a de-simplification, if that makes sense, or not to make things complicated, but just to acknowledge that there's so much complexity in the world. And I don't think we could have done it justice without sort of trying at least to give, and I mean, bearing in mind that this is still very overview level. It's not like we're giving anyone a crash course in attachment theory, right? And that's true of, like, dozens of topics. Like, there's lots more out there to go learn about if you want to, and all we're doing is pulling in the right threads to sort of have this conversation.
Right.
Yeah,
I really appreciate that. Like, look, thinking about what it is to try to cover the overview. It's overwhelming. I mean, I teach from a 500-page curriculum that I wrote myself, and still I'm like, every week I'm like, gosh, there's more. There's so much. So I appreciate that you took the time to do that broadening, and that you didn't get shy to write the long book, the one that, we don't need to read it all. I did read it all at once, but I'm a little disturbed that way. And I wanted to talk to you, but this does feel like a bookshelf book to me.
Yeah.
And I wanted, you brought attachment into the chat. Can we just talk about, you put in a piece that has been so important. So I'm a depth psychologist. So I trained in psychodynamics, and I love attachment theory, but I have struggled deeply with the problem that I see, that where people are not actually negotiating about whether a relationship is an attachment relationship, and it hurts my physical body to watch people expecting every partner to automatically be an attachment partner, and then there's disappointment and there's heartbreak and there's blame, and it can get really bad and messy. And I saw you just, like, deal with that in the course of explaining, really kind of even explaining something else, just sort of taking nothing for granted, that we have to ask, and then we have to get clear on, is this an attachment-based relationship? Because, like, Jessica Fern's work is amazing, but if somebody isn't consenting to be an attachment figure for you, what are we doing there? And I just really appreciate that you wove that in, so it becomes a deepening of the attachment conversation, which is powerful, but could be its own form of manipulation if we're requiring it or acting like we should just be entitled to it. So I really appreciate that.
Well, and I think, and this is the both and, right? This is where the dialogue comes in, because yes, and the flip side of that is that, how to phrase this, it is possible for someone to to be saying on the surface, and this is where I think a lot of the situationships become so painful, right? It's like to say on the surface, this isn't an attachment-based relationship. I am not consenting to meet those needs for you, but I'm going to act in all of these ways that are engaging your attachment system. And maybe because I actually want you to be a little attached to me so that I can get fed in that way without having to show up with the responsibility of being an attachment figure. So I really think it goes both ways there.
I couldn't agree more. And I think this is an incredibly difficult thing to grapple with from the inside. Like, am I showing up in full authenticity? Am I in integrity in what I have to offer? Because that's another piece that I saw you outline about the self-awareness of what do I have to offer? And it's a simple question at face value and incredibly complex as soon as you like just scratch the surface of that. What do I have to offer? Oh, I have to know. So I appreciate the welcoming approach to like, this is a core piece of the puzzle, that self-awareness can't be taken out of conscious relating, of really being in conscious relationships. And I really appreciate, Eve, what you're saying about that practice of flipping everything over allowed you to see through the generalized messaging, and now we can have a deeper discussion. And I'm wondering, did you approach the ethics chapter the same way? Because ethics is, I mean, people they even use the phrase like, oh, we're ethically non-monogamous. And I mean, I've met people who literally go from one day, they've never thought about the structure of their relationship at all, to the next day, they're like, I'm ENM. I have some personal issues with that, that I work on in my own personal dating life and I work on in my professional life. But you take on and actually write about and are talking about having an ethical framework. Would you each speak to that a little bit? Because I think it's a piece of the puzzle that is not talked about enough. Andrea, you want to kick us off?
You want to go first, Andrea?
Oh, gee. What to say about ethical frameworks? Yeah, they're important. I mean,
if you don't have one, get one.
Yeah, if you don't have one, go work on that. No, I mean, I think ethics is okay. So that was one of the chapters that I think took the longest and involved the most back and forth, and got reworked again, and like it's dense and in a good way. I think needed to be, right, but. Well, I mean, I think one of the pieces of conversation that we had around that as we worked on it was that, you can say ethical non-monogamy and there's there's a whole section about why that is and is not necessarily the right term, depending on what your take is on it. But also just this idea that ethics is one thing. And so we sort of were grappling with the notion of like, I mean, at the same time as we both think that there are some baseline elements of an ethical system that need to be present if you're going to do this, it's not, you can't just relativize everything, right? Some things you really do need to be honest. That really is a thing, among other things. And there were certain, you really can't be abusive and claim to be in an ethical framework, right? So if your ethics, even if you really believe in them wholeheartedly, if your ethical system results in harm, there's something wrong with your ethical system. And we're not going to say it's okay just because la-di-da, everyone's allowed to have their own choices, right? So there is an element of, at base, there are some stuff we have to agree on in order for this book to make sense and for our message to be coherent, right? But there's also quite a lot of variety in sort of how you might frame your ethics. And that might be that you draw on, the culture that you were raised in, or a religious system, or bits and pieces of other systems that you may have learned over time, whatever those might be, so we really each do kind of need to build our own. But to do non-monogamy in ways that are not harmful, there are some baseline pieces that need to be there, right? And so I think that chapter for us was really trying to strike the balance between giving a broad set of examples of and of ways that you could approach ethics, so that we're not saying here's the one, it's for everybody, thanks very much, go home, right? But also still sort of hold to something at the core that that we don't think you can just negotiate away because everyone says it's okay, right? Like sometimes it's actually still not okay. Does that make sense? What I feel like I want Eve to help me out.
I would love to hear Eve add on to that. And it's not okay just because everybody says it's okay. Now we're getting into the real meat of what are we talking about when we're talking about consent? What exactly can we agree to things, to all things? So
yeah, and I think what I think I heard Andrea say at the end there was just because you agreed to it doesn't make it ethical.
Yeah.
Well, that definitely describes the first 4 years of our relationship.
Jeepers. Yep,
it's
sure does.
Because I did agree, and this
you
is where
agreed to some stuff that was not ethical.
And it makes sense in retrospect. We were able to work through for many years. We worked on what was the power imbalance that created a situation where I couldn't say no, that I didn't even know I couldn't say no because of what was going on. So, I mean, we've lived it and then come out of it with a lot of reparation, but I have struggled with the guilt over having agreed initially. So as much as Ken, you've done great work of owning stuff, and I also know I'm always unpacking like, yep, and I said yes. And I was in there and I co-created that. And I don't want to leave. When I say abusive, I'm like, yeah, I was in it and I was in it. I can't not be responsible for being in it, even though there was a power differential. I was participating. And for me, that feels empowering that I get to say like, oh, I was in it. I'm not responsible for the harm that happened, but wow, even I thought I was okay and I wasn't okay. And I love being gentle to that earlier version of me and saying like, wow, she didn't know what ethical frameworks were yet.
We certainly didn't. There was no ethical framework anywhere near that relationship.
I mean, one of the major functions of abuse is to keep you from leaving, right? And sometimes that can be, actual logistical hurdles to leaving, like threats of violence, financial control, that sort of thing. But often it is just emotional abuse that, keeps your view of yourself and the view of your possibilities so small, or keeps you so keyed up in survival mode all the time that it's impossible for you to see the exits. I mean, I have done. I spent several years just completely fascinated by cult studies and cult abuse in particular. And one of the cults that I read and listened and watched a whole bunch of stuff about was NXIVM. And there's a really interesting story in that whole case, which if you've there's a 2-season series called The Vow. And in the second season, they go into this story. There was a woman who was kept in a room for, I think it was almost 2 years. So kept in a dark room with like the windows papered over and like a mattress on the floor. And this was punishment for some sort of transgression that she'd done. And this information was brought to trial. And of course, one of the things that the defense asked her at trial was, well, was the door locked? And it wasn't. The door was never locked. She was told she couldn't leave the room. She was told she had to stay in the room. I mean, they did. She was an immigrant, and they took her passport, so there was also that element of
door
coercion.
Was locked.
But I mean, I think I could be getting this wrong, but I think there was finally a point at the end where she just went and opened the door and left the house and walked down the street, like realized that she could leave that room. But, they were trying to make the defense, trying to make the point that, well, you had that choice all along. But of course, the way this entire structure of coercion and bounded choice happened, was what they were doing ethical? Because she technically could have left,
right.
know?
Right. And
that makes it all okay.
That makes it fine. And abuse is as abuse does. Like it just is. It happened. And that's such a stark example that I think we could all agree, maybe everybody but that defense attorney could agree that like, no, but look. And that's been one of my favorite parts about thinking about ethical frameworks as an individual thing that we have to build, is that I can't look to someone else to tell me whether this is ethical or not. And I think about, so I wouldn't want that defense attorney, that one, in that case, I wouldn't want them handing me some objectively ethical framework. So Eve, how did you approach that chapter and like?
Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting one. In the first edition, that piece of the book had been kind of a huge piece of work for me that I had invested a lot of time and research and attention in, and I remember feeling pretty good about at the time. And then book came out, put it away, didn't think much about it. But what I did come to realize actually not too long after the book came out is, I'm not an ethicist. I'm not a philosopher. I have no formal training in either. And so, my learning and understanding and thinking about it was still very shallow. I had, I think, a deep, personal ethical compass that informed what I was doing, but I didn't have a lot of exposure to sort of more formalized thinking than that. And in the 10 years between the two editions, I have spent a huge amount of time exposing myself to different schools of thought in that area. And so I would say that I have a much more in-depth, nuanced perspective on ethics in general, and was able to bring that to the new chapter. And so I think it was just the original book was just much more simplistic than this new edition is. And I think also this idea of expanding the concept of ethics outside of our intimate relationships, that there is this iteration of, as we remark in the book, like the personal is political, right? Like there's a way that we engage with the world, the things that are going on in the world around us, and then the way that infiltrates into our intimate relationships, but also then we put that back out into the world. So that idea, I think, was quite new in the book. And yeah, as you know, we do have a section in there about the term ethical non-monogamy and why we don't use that, and we removed the word ethical from the subtitle as well, because it's not a given, right? That's necessarily what we're doing here.
Right. I just appreciate that, because I don't find it to be a helpful label that people are picking up, and it implies so much. And I have yet, in my 15 years of being non-monogamous, I have yet to meet somebody who really could express to me their ethical framework, who wasn't somebody who studied that for their own reasons, right? Somebody who was just doing this, like, oh yeah, I use the label ENM. It's a very casual use, and that's a big word. It's a big word that means something. So I appreciate that, taking the word's meaning seriously enough to let it have its use, because now I'm thinking, oh, if somebody does describe their ethical framework from this perspective in more than two, like you're outlining, like, here's a perspective, there's a way to think about it. It could transform how people are having their conversations, and I've heard this conversation. I've heard, Chrissy from the internet. It comes to mind, like banging the drum for, we can't just toss around ethics. We gotta say what we're doing. So I know that this conversation has been had, but often the newer people aren't getting it. They're not introduced to it early enough. But More Than Two is a book that people could come across really early in their journey. And that makes me excited, because I'm often working with people who are in their transition time, those first few weeks, months, or years of considering something new. So I'm loving that you're centering, ethics and intersectionality, and being clear that we have to broaden this conversation or it's not valid. That's at least what I got out of the intersectionality piece. Am I getting that right? Was the intersectionality woven into this because you each feel that it needed to be? How did that take center stage there?
I mean, so did the version that you got include our prefaces? Or
yes.
Did you?
Yeah.
Okay, so because there was a version that went out earlier without the prefaces, because I think our prefaces do get into that quite a bit. But I think there was just a point in my life where I realized that there was no separation really between, the way I live my life and have my personal relationships and everything else going on in the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And so we can't really talk about one, especially if we want to talk about ethics and not talk about the other.
Right.
And I would say that for me, one of the things when I think about the ethics question and the intersectionality piece, that my concern about that is what kept me pretty quiet for a number of years, frankly, because I started to be like, okay, so I have this, history of blogging and writing about non-monogamy and sex and all these things, and the fucking world is on fire. Like, who cares about the intricacies of having group sex? Like, I could not somehow put together this sort of like everything falling apart environmentally and economically and politically and like wars everywhere. Like, it's just like everything is terrible, you know, with what I perceived, or I guess, and maybe not exactly convinced myself, but felt like maybe it was just frivolous, like these topics were just not the most important thing, and I should just shut up because there's so many voices that really need to be heard, and I'm not really sure mine is one of them. And that's, I think, so I really sort of pulled back from blogging, and it's not the only thing that was going on with me, but it was certainly one of the things that, when my own sort of personal health journey and stuff sort of began to ease up, it was one of the things that prevented me from just diving right back in. And so I'm grateful to Eve for sort of pulling me out of that a little bit, because in attacking this topic, I was like, oh no, they do come together. Actually, it's still worth talking about human relationships and human sexuality. They aren't going to go away just because of disaster. This is, like how we connect with each other. We have to do even when the world is on fire. Okay, so how can we do it right? And it is more of a piece than I couldn't previously bridge that gap in my own mind. So this was an opportunity of it.
I think that the prefaces really provide a strong foundation for the book. So right away, I was feeling it contextualizes it, because the world is on fire, but we're still relating to each other, and we don't want to not relate well just because the world's on fire. It all came together.
It's not going to help.
It's not going to help. No,
it doesn't make things better. And also some of the ways that we need to relate to each other can be foundational in our coping skills to manage the world being on fire, and to, honestly, in some ways, non-monogamy is, it's a joke, but it's also not a joke of like, who can afford to be monogamous in today's economy, right? But it's kind of not funny also, in a lot of ways. Boy, would it be easier to be in a triad household where we're sharing the bills and so forth, right? Like,
I miss that.
Right?
We're currently living with just 2 adults, and I miss that right now. Yeah. I'm accepting applications. No, I'm just teasing, but I have
show up and
considered
get along with us so that you can contribute to household expenses. Yeah.
Right. I love that for all of us.
Yeah.
I had something to add as well, which was, I think for me, something else that has affected my thinking and my trajectory has been the development of Thornapple Press. Because when I published the first edition of More Than Two, I wasn't expecting to found a relationship publishing company. But after More Than Two did really well, several other people came to me and wanted their books published as well. And because More Than Two was doing so well, I sort of took it as an opportunity to use that success to facilitate other voices being in the space. Because it was almost like, I felt like More Than Two in many ways came out of the community, and I kind of wanted to give back to the community and elevate other voices. And then over time, it developed, its own sort of vision and image. And then, we got Polly Secure and Jessica Fern's books, and we started expanding, Kevin Patterson's book. We published books on bisexuality and sex work. And so, but the whole time I have really been, like one of our authors, Joellen Noddy, once referred to, to us as like the press for sensitive overthinkers. Or maybe she said something about being a sensitive overthinker, and I said, "Yeah, well, that's who we are. We're the press for sensitive overthinkers." But
it's a group thing.
That's our unofficial tagline, right? Because it's like, there's other relationship publishers and there's other sexuality publishers, but we're the ones for the nerds. We're the ones that don't shy away from like the really heady, thoughtful, the big conversations about ethics and how yeah.
You have
Go
some
ahead.
of Carrie Jenkins' work, right?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, when I think about heady, nerdy, delicious relationship work, I think, oh, there,
Yeah.
Carrie Jenkins' work is there. And thank you for bringing these books. So what I'm hearing is that you took the power that was handed to you through the success of, not just through More Than Two, but through the success that it was experiencing, and you leveraged that into passing the mic and making sure other people had a way to give voice to big ideas that need to be heard. Joellen's work, like I'm thinking about like all of these books that are coming to mind. I'm like, oh, I don't think I actually connected the dots to think about that them all coming under your umbrella there, but I see the theme. Yeah. I'm very grateful. Yeah. Eve, is that exhausting for you? Just like, is it exhausting to be in that position of like shepherding these works forward? Maybe that's not the right question.
Yeah, I mean, it can be. Yeah, I would just say being an entrepreneur is exhausting, right? Yeah, so, for sure. But I have to say, like, I have a really amazing team and could not do any of it without them. And so they carry a lot of the exhaustion as well. So.
It's amazing. Okay, so these two books are coming out very soon, and I want to make sure people know where to find them and book tour. So would you tell us where would you love for people to buy the books? Where is your first choice where people should go find the books and buy them?
So if you go to morethan2.ca, this book is there along with all of the other books in the More Than Two Essential series. So remember the CA at the end. And if you click on those, it'll take you to a page that has links to like major retailers. So we absolutely prefer that you buy through independent bookstores. Particularly if you're in Canada, please buy through local Canadian bookshops. But wherever you are. So our first links are actually, we have links to several Indigenous booksellers, both in the US and Canada. But then below that, there's links to buy from other independent retailers throughout North America. And then if you must support Jeff Bezos, there are links to that at the bottom. So.
If that is the path, then that is the path. And
we'll roll our eyes and judge you.
We at least get a little bit. If you use our referral links, we at least get a little bit of a kickback from that. So
I appreciate you just acknowledging the reality. And how could our audience find each of you, like follow your future work? Is there any place that you would like, either social media or newsletter? Is there any place at all that people should find out more about Eve and Andrea as individuals?
I would say, I think Andrea and I both use our personal social media mostly for personal stuff. So for the professional and the book stuff, following Thornapple Press. So it's at Thornapple Press on Instagram. It's Thornapple Press on Facebook. We're on LinkedIn and YouTube as well. I think those are all the major presences. And then More Than Two also has presences. So it's MTT Book on Instagram. It's More Than Two Book on Facebook. And then I believe it's More Than Two Book on YouTube. Do we have, I think those are all of the online presences for that.
Our editor will make sure that all of those are captured and are in the show notes as well, so that it's easeful for people to click through, get what they want from where they want. Andrea, how about you? Do you have anything that you would like to add? Because I want to make sure that people know how to find your work.
Like Eve, most of my social media is private, but I am quite active still on, I call it shitter, so X /Twitter. because I built a pretty decent following there over many, many years, and a lot of them are still around. So I'm there, but I'm also on Blue Sky, and those are both for me, they're public facing. Like Facebook is my living room. The others are out there in the world. So yeah.
Excellent.
And you can find
My
me there
personal...
go
ahead.
Sex Geek AZ on Shitter, and more or less the same thing on Blue Sky. I'd have to go look, but my last name is not common, so you shouldn't have trouble finding me.
Pretty easy to find you.
Yeah.
And Eve?
Yeah, I'm also pretty active on Blue Sky, and it's just Eve Rickert on Blue Sky.
Excellent. Awesome. I love that. Thank you both so very much. Thank you for this generous conversation, for spending what I can only imagine is thousands of hours creating this book. I am so grateful, so deeply grateful. Thank you for presenting these ideas to the world and for doing all of the work that you do, shepherding, guiding other voices forward as well. Thanks so much, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I have so much gratitude for you both and for this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your enthusiasm.
Thanks for having us.
It's pretty great.
So there's no one right way to design your relationship. And lots of people, actually about 25%, according to a recent national survey, are interested in some type of open relationship. But how do you know if you are ready to open up happily? Not everyone is, and that's no problem. I've got a 60-second quiz that will give you the answer. And even better, you'll walk away with your next step, whether you're good to go or not so much when it comes to opening up. And this is no BuzzFeed nonsense. I personally designed this quiz from my years of academic research. Go to joliquiz.com. That's JOLIQUIZ.com and find out if you're ready to open up happily and what to do if you are or if you're not.